the way people in power are chosen is the most consequential mechanic of how a nation operates. Currently in the US, we and many other wealthy democratic nations, we primarily choose government officials through a process, a voting method called choose one voting. So it is, which is exactly what you're familiar with, where every citizen gets to make one mark per race on their ballot to show support for a single person to represent them in government. So choose one voting, unfortunately, is one of the worst voting methods ever created. Choose one voting systematically polarizes people, feeding this toxic idea that we can only advocate for one group or one set of ideas at a time. This contributes to the dreaded spoiler effect you may have heard of, where similar voters split their votes between two similar candidates, potentially causing both of them to lose to a third candidate who may be disliked by all of those similar voters. Fear of this mechanical problem that's baked into choose one voting leads to the strategic lesser evil voting we find ourselves constantly hearing about, and an inevitable, unavoidable trend toward this two-party system that we found ourselves stuck in. It's the math of the method, not a vice of the voters. Fortunately, there are dozens of different voting methods to choose from. One of the blessings of modern voting science is the whittling down to just a few primary recommendations for voting method reform in the US right now. One of our favorites is approval voting. Approval voting is comically simple. It's nothing more than changing the instructions on the ballot from choose one to choose one or more. So instead of bubbling in next to just one candidate in a race, you're free to bubble in next to as many candidates as you like, or all the candidates you approve of. Then the tallying is exactly the same as what you're familiar with. Just add up all the votes or all of the approvals, and the most approved candidate wins. This one tiny change has dramatic positive effects on election results. And that almost completely eliminates the spoiler effect we were talking about earlier and flips the dynamic of our voting from polarity to consensus. The real power of approval voting is in its simplicity. I like to describe switching from choose one voting to approval voting as the highest and fastest return on investment for any political advocacy in the US right now. Because approval voting is nothing more than changing the instructions on the ballot, it's fully compatible with existing electoral infrastructure throughout the country, costing taxpayers basically nothing for this incredibly positive change. The only real financial cost to shifting to approval voting is voter education, which can be done far more rapidly and cheaply than any other voting method reform because it's so simple. And that voter education is fully supported by and historically successful from the Center for Election Science, which we've seen, for example, in Fargo, North Dakota and St. Louis, Missouri, where the reform passed by supermajorities in both municipalities and ended up costing the taxpayers basically nothing to implement. Additionally, approval voting is more flexible than other voting methods, allowing it to be compatible with more existing election codes across the states than any other alternative voting method, which has actually enabled me to work with the Center for Election Science, like I said earlier, to begin volunteer work on a future campaign to bring approval voting for city council elections right here in Austin. Where other voting reform measures have failed before and are failing right now due to legal incompatibility. So we're super excited because we honestly believe that approval voting is going to be able to break through that barrier here. But what it really comes down to at the end of the day is the power of the vote. By only allowing you to express support for one candidate at a time under choose one voting, the power of your vote is limited in that exact way. So approval voting unlocks the power of your vote and leads to better candidates running, better candidates winning, and more accountability for those people in power, our elected officials who ultimately direct how the nation operates.